statement on the response of the Russian government to the incident in Salisbury. First, on behalf of the whole House, let me pay tribute once again to the bravery and professionalism of all the emergency services, doctors, nurses and investigation teams who have led the response to this appalling incident. And also to the fortitude of the people of Salisbury. And let me reassure them that, as Public Health England have made clear, the ongoing risk to public health is low, and the government will continue to do everything possible to support this historic city to recover fully. Mr. Speaker, on Monday I set out that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a Novichok, a military-grade nerve agent developed by Russia. Based on this capability, combined with their record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, including against former intelligence officers whom they regard as legitimate targets, the UK government concluded that it was highly likely that Russia was responsible for this reckless and despicable act. And there were only two plausible explanations. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or conceivably the Russian government could have lost control of a military-grade nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others. Mr. Speaker, it was right to offer Russia the opportunity to provide an explanation. But their response has demonstrated complete disdain for the gravity of these events. They have provided no credible explanation that could suggest they lost control of their nerve agent. No explanation as to how this agent came to be used in the United Kingdom. No explanation as to why Russia has an undeclared chemical weapons programme in contravention of international law. Instead, they have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And as I set out on Monday, it has taken place against the backdrop of a well-established pattern of Russian state aggression across Europe and beyond. It must therefore be met with a full and robust response, beyond the actions we have already taken since the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, and to counter this pattern of Russian aggression elsewhere. As the discussion in this House on Monday made clear, it is essential that we now come together with our allies to defend our security, to stand up for our values, and to send a clear message to those who would seek to undermine them. This morning I chaired a further meeting of the National Security Council, where we agreed immediate actions to dismantle the Russian espionage network in the UK, urgent work to develop new powers to tackle all forms of hostile state activity, and to ensure that those seeking to carry out such activity cannot enter the UK, and additional steps to suspend all planned high-level contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. Let me start with the immediate actions. Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that following the murder of Mr. Litvinenko, the UK expelled 4 diplomats. Under the Vienna Convention, the United Kingdom will now expel 23 Russian diplomats who have been identified as undeclared intelligence officers. They have just 1 week to leave. This will be the single biggest expulsion for over 30 years, and it reflects the fact that this is not the first time that the Russian state has acted against our country. Through these expulsions, we will fundamentally degrade Russian intelligence capability in the UK for years to come. And if they seek to rebuild it, we will prevent them from doing so. Second, we will urgently develop proposals for new legislative powers to harden our defences against all forms of hostile state activity. This will include the addition of a targeted power to detain those suspected of hostile state activity at the UK border. This power is currently only permitted in relation to those suspected of terrorism. And I have asked the Home Secretary to consider whether there is a need for new counter-espionage powers to clamp down on the full spectrum of hostile activities of foreign agents in our country. Mr. Speaker, as I set out on Monday, we will also table a government amendment to the sanctions bill to strengthen our powers to impose sanctions in response to the violation of human rights. In doing so, we will play our part in an international effort to punish those responsible for the sorts of abuses suffered by Sergei Magnitsky. And I hope, as with all the measures I am setting out today, that this will command cross-party support. Mr. Speaker, we will also make full use of existing powers to enhance our efforts to monitor and track the intentions of those travelling to the UK who could be engaged in activity that threatens the security of the UK and of our allies. So we will increase checks on private flights, customs and freight. We will freeze Russian state assets wherever we have the evidence that they may be used to threaten the life or property of UK nationals or residents. And led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. There is no place for these people or their money in our country. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. While our response must be robust, it must also remain true to our values as a liberal democracy that believes in the rule of law. Many Russians have made this country their home, abide by our laws, and make an important contribution to our country, which we must continue to welcome. But to those who seek to do us harm, my message is simple. You are not welcome here. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to our bilateral relationship. As I said on Monday, we have had a very simple approach to Russia: engage but beware. And I continue to believe it is not in our national interest to break off all dialogue between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. But in the aftermath of this appalling act against our country, this relationship cannot be the same. So we will suspend all planned high-level bilateral contacts between the United Kingdom and the Russian Federation. This includes revoking the invitation to Foreign Minister Lavrov to pay a reciprocal visit to the UK and confirming there will be no attendance by ministers or indeed members of the royal family at this summer's World Cup in Russia. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we will deploy a range of tools from across the full breadth of our national security apparatus in order to counter the threats of hostile state activity. While I have set out some of these measures today, members on all sides will understand that there are some that cannot be shared publicly for reasons of national security. And of course, there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time should we face further Russian provocation. Mr. Speaker, none of the actions we take are intended to damage legitimate activity or prevent contacts between our populations. We have no disagreement with the people of Russia, who have been responsible for so many great achievements throughout their history. Many of us looked at a post-Soviet Russia with hope. We wanted a better relationship, and it is tragic that President Putin has chosen to act in this way. But we will not tolerate the threat to life of British people and others on British soil from the Russian government, nor will we tolerate such a flagrant breach of Russia's international obligations. Mr. Speaker, as I set out on Monday, the United Kingdom does not stand alone in confronting Russian aggression. In the last 24 hours, I have spoken to President Trump, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron. We have agreed to cooperate closely in responding to this barbaric act and to coordinate our efforts to stand up for the rules-based international order which Russia seeks to undermine. I will also speak to other allies and partners in the coming days. And I welcome the strong expressions of support from NATO and from partners across the European Union and beyond. Later today in New York, the UN Security Council will hold open consultations where we will be pushing for a robust international response. We have also notified the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons about Russia's use of this nerve agent, and we are working with the police to enable the OPCW to independently verify our analysis. Mr. Speaker, this was not just an act of attempted murder in Salisbury, nor just an act against the UK. It is an affront to the prohibition on the use of chemical weapons, and it is an affront to the rules-based system on which we and our international partners depend. We will work with our allies and partners to confront such actions wherever they threaten our security at home and abroad, and I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement and echo absolutely her words about the service of our emergency and public services. The attack in Salisbury was an appalling act of violence. Nerve agents are abominable if used in any war. It is utterly reckless to use them in a civilian environment. This attack in Britain has concerned our allies in the European Union, NATO and the UN, and their words of solidarity have strengthened our position diplomatically. Our response as a country must be guided by the rule of law, support for international agreements and respect for human rights. So when it comes to the use of chemical weapons on British soil, it is essential that the government works with the United Nations to strengthen its chemical weapons monitoring system and involves the Office of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. The Prime Minister said on Monday, either this was a direct act by the Russian state or the Russian government lost control of their potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get in the hands of others. Our response must be both decisive and proportionate and based on clear evidence. If the government believes that it is still a possibility that Russia negligently lost control of a military-grade nerve agent, what action is being taken through the OPCW with our allies? I welcome the fact the police are working with the OPCW. And has the Prime Minister taken the necessary steps under the Chemical Weapons Convention to make a formal request for evidence from the Russian government under Article 9.2? How has she responded to the Russian government's request for a sample of the agent used in the Salisbury attack to run its own tests? Has high-resolution trace analysis been run on a sample of the nerve agent, and has that revealed any evidence as to the location of its production or the identity of its perpetrators? And can the Prime Minister update the House on what conversations, if any, she has had with the Russian government? Dialogue with Russia, in the interest of our own and wider international security. With many countries, Mr. Speaker, speaking out alongside us, the circumstances demand that we build an international consensus to address the use of chemical weapons. We should urge our international allies to join us and call on Russia to reveal without delay full details of its chemical weapons programme to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It is, as we on these benches have expressed before, a matter of huge regret that our country's diplomatic capacity has been stripped back with cuts of 25% in the last 5 years. It is, Mr. Speaker,
the right honourable gentleman must be heard. There will be adequate opportunity for colleagues on both sides of the House to put questions. Members must be heard. Jeremy Corbyn.
I couldn't understand a word of what the Foreign Secretary just said, Mr. Speaker, but his behaviour demeans his office. It is in moments such as these that governments realise how vital strong diplomacy and political pressure are for our security and national interest. The measures we take have to be effective, not just for the long-term security of our citizens, but to secure a world free of chemical weapons. And, Mr. Speaker, we must do more to address the dangers posed by the state's relationship with unofficial mafia-like groups and corrupt oligarchs. We must also expose the flows of ill-gotten cash between the Russian state and billionaires who become stupendously rich by looting their country and subsequently use London to protect their wealth. We welcome the Prime Minister's statement today, clearly committing to support the Magnitsky amendments and implementing them as soon as possible, as we on this side have long pushed for. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, Nikolai Glushkov, a Russian exile who was close friends with the late oligarch Boris Berezovsky, was found dead in his London home. What reassurance can she give to citizens of Russian origin living in Britain that they are safe here? Mr. Speaker, the events in Salisbury earlier this month are abominable and have been rightly condemned right across the House. Britain has to build a consensus with our allies, and we support the Prime Minister in... Mr. Speaker, we support the Prime Minister in taking multilateral action and firm action to ensure we strengthen the Chemical Weapons Convention, to ensure that this dreadful, appalling act, which we totally condemn, never happens again in our country.
The right honourable gentleman raised a number of questions around the nerve agent that had been used. He asked if we were putting together an international coalition to call on Russia to reveal the details of its chemical weapons programme to the OPCW. That is indeed what we did. We gave the Russian government the opportunity, through the démarche that my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, delivered to the Russian ambassador here in London earlier this week, to do just that. They have not done so. He's raised a number of questions. He asked about the corrupt elites and money going through London. As I said in my statement, led by the National Crime Agency, we will continue to bring all the capabilities of UK law enforcement to bear against serious criminals and corrupt elites. There is no place for these people or their money in our country, and that work is ongoing. He talked about getting an international consensus together. As I have said, I've spoken to Chancellor Merkel, to President Trump, to President Macron. Others have also expressed their support. Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, said we stand in solidarity with our allies in the United Kingdom, and those responsible for both those who committed the crime and those who ordered it must face appropriately serious consequences. The NATO Council has expressed deep concern at the first offensive use of a nerve agent on alliance territory since NATO's foundation, and allies agreed the attack was a clear breach of international norms and agreements. And Donald Tusk, the President of the EU Council, said, I express my full solidarity with PM Theresa May in the face of the brutal attack, inspired most likely by Moscow. I'm ready to put the issue on next week's European Council. So we will be doing that. But I say to the right honourable gentleman, this is not a question of our diplomacy, of what diplomatic support we have around the world. This is a question of the culpability of the Russian state for an act on our soil. And he said that we should be trying to build a consensus. It's clear from the conversations I've had with allies that we have a consensus with our allies. It was clear from the remarks that were made by backbenchers across the whole of this House on Monday that there is a consensus across the backbenches of this House. I am only sorry that the consensus does not go as far as the right honourable gentleman have taken the opportunity, as the UK government has done, to condemn the culpability of the Russian state.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, it seems to me, without any access to closed information, that the choice of this particularly bizarre and dreadful way of killing an individual is a deliberate choice by the Russian government to put their signature on a particular killing, so that other defectors are left in no doubt that it is the Russian government that will act if they're disappointed in any way by their actions. Now, in the light of that, the only sensible question that the Leader of the Opposition asked was what consultation we propose to have with NATO, the other European countries, with the American government, about positive action that could be taken to prevent this continuing defiance of international law with the defiance of all the rules on testing and possession of chemical weapons. It's not just a question of expressing our anger about Salisbury. This is actually a serious threat to the safety of the Western world, unless and until we all do something together to actually start getting the Russians to do something, as opposed to simply ignore us.
Well said.
My right honourable friend and learned friend is absolutely right, and that is why we are not only talking to allies bilaterally, but there will, as I understand it, be a meeting of the NATO Council tomorrow, at which this issue will be considered. As the President of the EU Council has said, he will be putting this on the agenda of the European Union Council meeting at the end of next week. And my right honourable and learned friend is absolutely right. While we rightly initially focus on the use of this nerve agent here in the UK and its impact on us here in the UK, this is about the illegal use of chemical weapons by the Russian state. And it is about an illegal programme to in developing those chemical weapons by the Russian state. And we will leave no stone unturned in order to work with our allies to ensure that we respond appropriately to that.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of her statement. As the Prime Minister has stated, the attack on Mr. Skripal and his daughter was an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, there has to be a robust response to the use of terror on our streets. We must act in a measured way to show that we will simply not tolerate this behaviour. And in this regard, I welcome and associate with those of us in these benches with the measures contained in the statement. On this matter, I commit my party to working constructively with the government. I am sure the House will join me with extending thanks to the police and security services who are working round the clock on the recent case in Salisbury. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, it has been warming to see our closest friends and allies across Europe expressing solidarity and support. Our friends globally must join with us by standing up to this abuse of state power by Russia. And I look forward to discussions in the United Nations. The United Nations must speak with a clear and an unambiguous voice. Mr. Speaker, the fact that we are expelling the largest number of undeclared intelligence officers in over 30 years is welcome, and is the desire to examine what can be done from a legislative perspective to defend against hostile state activity. As someone who has previously supported the so-called Majinsky measures, I am pleased that the government is signalling action in this area. And let me commend the actions of Bill Browder, who I've had the opportunity to meet previously, someone that has been personally at massive risk and has stood up to the effects of Russian state power. Mr. Speaker, financial sanctions are welcome, and we must redouble our efforts against any money laundering by those responsible. It must be clear to the Russian authorities that we will not tolerate activities that infringe international law. Whilst we support the PM's actions, we will continue to scrutinise them carefully, and we must ensure proper scrutiny of any new proposed legislation. Our thoughts are with those in Russia who have suffered from abuse of state power. There is no doubt that that is what we are seeing. And in doing so, we look forward to a time where we can engage positively, for a time of peace and cooperation. But the only response today must be a robust one towards the Kremlin and to Russia.
Can I Mr. Speaker, can I once again thank the right honourable gentleman for not just the tone of his response, but for the comments that he has made. Can I reassure him that, of course, any legislative proposals we bring forward will have due scrutiny in this House? Can I thank him for his constructive offer to work with the government on this issue, because it is a matter that should concern us across the whole House? And can I reassure him that although I have made reference to a number of allies who have spoken in support of the United Kingdom in this, others have too. Canada, Australia, for example, have also been very clear that a robust response is appropriate to this. And once again, I welcome the comments made by the right honourable gentleman.
Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, may I commend my right honourable friend for her strong leadership and in rising to this challenge. As others have shown, they also, too, in positions of leadership, have risen to the challenge. I'm only sorry that others in such positions have fallen well short. Can I ask her, in the conversation she is due to have with her allies, as she's quite right to do, she may raise with the German government the issue of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that they are engaged with the Russians, which will cut revenues from Ukraine and Eastern Europe and give Russia an unparalleled ability to bully those countries in the future. If Russia is, as we now believe, a rogue state, could she please try and persuade our allies in Europe and elsewhere not to treat with them and make them better off?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and can I say to him that I think one of the things that we will be discussing with our allies is how we can ensure that the robust message about the act that has taken place on UK soil is consistently given and continues to be given by all our allies. As regards Nord Stream 2, this is a matter that is regularly discussed at the European Union Council, as my right honourable friend would, I suspect, imagine.
Yvette Cooper.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement? Her conclusion about the culpability of the Russian state is an immensely serious one, and that, in addition to their breaches of international law, of the use of chemical weapons, but also their continued disregard for the rule of law and for human rights, must be met with unequivocal condemnation. Welcome both the measures she has taken to downgrade the intelligence capability that the Russian state has, but also, in particular, the work that I understand has started with the United Nations. It is important to expose Russia and what they are doing within the United Nations and to build the broadest possible support against them. Can she say a bit more about what she is doing on that front?
Can I also thank the right honourable lady for the strength of the statement that she has just made, which I know is representative of many of her right honourable and honourable friends on the backbenches opposite. We are taking this matter to the United Nations. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has already spoken to the UN Secretary-General about this issue. It will be part of an open discussion that is taking place tomorrow. That is the start of a process of looking at this issue. As I say, but as I indicated in response to my right honourable and learned friend, Member for Rushcliffe, this is not just about the incident that has taken place here in the United Kingdom. It is about this use of chemical weapons, this illegal use of chemical weapons that has taken place, and the role of the Russian state in the development of chemical weapons contrary to international law.
Julian Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, no reasonable person can possibly doubt that the Russian government has behaved with arrogance, with inhumanity, and with contempt, not least in failing to respond to the Prime Minister's deadline, which it surely would have done if it had known it was innocent of this charge. In welcoming the Prime Minister's expulsion of 23 diplomats who are really intelligence agencies, will I ask her to make it clear that any retaliation in kind by the Russian government will be met by further expulsions, possibly including even the ambassador, who spends so much time coming to talk to us in this place, bemoaning the poor state of Anglo-Russian relations. And will she accept that Russia traditionally respects strength and despises weakness, and that the time has come to recognize that 2% of GDP is not enough to spend on defense when we are reverting to the sort of adversarial relationship when we used to spend a much higher proportion of GDP in ensuring that this country was well defended.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his remarks? As I said in my statement, in response to his first point, there are other measures we stand ready to deploy at any time should we face further Russian provocation. On the other point that he made, of course, as we have been looking through our national security capability review and our modernising defence programme review, what we are doing is ensuring that for the variety and diversity of threats that this country faces, we have the resources and the capabilities available to deal with those threats. But of course, as those threats diversify, not all of them will be responded to by what is conventionally normally considered to be defence.
Sir Vincent Cable.
Can I say that I and my party fully support the Prime Minister's statement? Can I ask, what is her response to the brave leader of the opposition in Russia, Alexei Navalny, who is not allowed to stand in the presidential election, who has said that the most effective action the British government can take is to use its legal powers, such as the unexplained wealth orders, against named individuals who are critical to the Putin operation. And she names in particular Mr. Alisher Usmanov, who has substantial property and sporting interests, and the first Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Igor Shuvalov, who, amongst other things, owns a £14 million flat overlooking the Ministry of Defence. Will she act?
Well, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for the support that he has given to the actions being taken by the government. Can I also say to him, as I did in my statement, that we do, of course, look at issues around corrupt elites, we look at the issues around criminal finances, we look at using the tools and capabilities that are at our disposal. The National Crime Agency is continuing that work.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for her impressive leadership in this matter. I associate myself, actually, unusually with the leader of the Liberal Democrats in calling for more use of unexplained wealth orders. But could I also ask her if she will use the tools at her disposal to expose the wealth of the Putin family? $300 billion or more has been stolen from the Russian people by that man. We should expose him for what he is and not be a useful idiot hiding behind legalism of his crimes.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his contribution and suggestion? Can I also say on the unexplained wealth orders, of course, those are tools that we do use, but we have to use these properly in accordance with the rule of law, following the due processes that should take place.
Ms. Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, agree with her analysis and fully support the government's actions. I understand that the Foreign Office has called for an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council. What does the Prime Minister think the result of this is likely to be, given that one permanent member of the Council is engaging in unlawful attacks on another? And does she share my concerns that Russia's actions in this country, in Ukraine, and in backing Assad's murderous regime in Syria means that the current Security Council mechanism is broken?
Can I say thank the honourable lady for her comments, and also say, as I said earlier, the Foreign Secretary did speak to the UN Secretary General yesterday, and later today in New York, the UN Security Council will hold initial consultations. Obviously, Russia is a member of that Security Council, but I think it's important that we continue to use the international organisations that are available to us. The United Nations is a protector of the international rules-based order. That's what it should be, and we will be continuing to press for a robust international response.
Sir Andrew Mitchell.
It's clear that almost unanimously across the House there is support for my right honourable friend's proportionate and right response to this crisis. In particular, she's absolutely right to use the mechanisms of the United Nations to make clear to everyone what has happened in this case. And will she also bear in mind that in Syria, Russia has either indirectly or directly authorised and used chemical weapons? And may I also thank her for what she has said about the Magnitsky Amendment, which many of us across the House have been working for some time now. I hope that she will give consideration for implementing the full Magnitsky Amendment as it has been implemented in America and in Canada.
Can I first of all say to my right honourable friend, and it picks up a point that was actually made from the previous question, that this isn't simply one act we see from Russia. This is a pattern of actions by Russia where they are undertaking in a variety of ways different actions. Of course, what we see them doing in Syria, what we've seen them doing by the illegal annexation of Crimea and their activities in the Donbass. We also see their use of propaganda, their attempt to interfere in elections across the continent of Europe. These are all the actions that the Russian state is getting involved in. And in response to the second point, we will bring forward a government amendment to reflect the Magnitsky considerations and to ensure that we have got the strongest possible means to deal with these issues.
Sammy Wilson.
We welcome the decisive action which has been taken by the Prime Minister today, and it sits in contrast with the policy of appeasement that we have heard from the front bench of the Labour Party. And I am sure that the people of the United Kingdom are pleased that it is the Prime Minister who is standing behind that dispatch box today, defending the rule of law and the citizens of this country. However, she has told us that she has spoken to our allies over the last couple of days. Perhaps she could tell us, apart from words of support, what actions have they committed to ensure that, first of all, a message is sent out about this action and actions in the future?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks and for the support of the DUP for the action that the government is taking on this matter. And can I say to him that in relation to the actions to be taken by international allies, of course they were waiting for us to announce the various actions that we were taking, the decision taken by the National Security Council this morning, but we will be holding further discussions with our allies about the way in which they can support what we are doing by actions themselves.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely agree with the approach adopted by my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, in how she's responded to this outrageous attack. She agreed with me that the difficulty we face is not so much in getting the concurrence of our allies in agreeing on the nature of the outrage, but how we are going to craft a sustained strategy so that those of us who believe in the rules-based international system can apply the necessary leverage and persuasion on Russia to conform to it. And that the very serious risk that we run is that if we don't succeed in doing this, the level of violence that Russia is going to exercise with impunity against other states and us will simply increase. And that this is something which our allies in particular must have regard to if we are going to make any progress.
My right honourable and learned friend is absolutely correct that this is an issue which we need to address in that wider sense, because it is about the way in which the Russian state is acting, it believes, with impunity in a whole variety of ways, the way in which it is flouting the international rules-based order. We must come together as allies to ensure that we are supporting that international rules-based order and that we have not just a collective agreement, but a collective approach which ensures that we can challenge what Russia is doing. But he's also right. One of the points I think we should be making to our allies is that this may have happened in the United Kingdom, but actually it is something that could be happening in any of these states.
Hilary Benn.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I join others in welcoming the measures that the Prime Minister has announced today. As Russia has chosen to act against us in such an outrageous way, we have to demonstrate our determination to defend ourselves. Given that Russia's usual response is to deny all responsibility for such actions, as well as seeking the assistance of the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in identifying the sample, does she intend, as any member state is entitled to do, to ask for that organisation to carry out an investigation, including an inspection of any facilities or locations in Russia where this nerve agent, in all probability, was produced.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that we will be talking to the OPCW about a number of ways in which not just the sample of the nerve agent used here in the United Kingdom can be independently verified, but other actions that the OPCW might be able to take.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
May I welcome the decision of the government to refer the patiently and carefully acquired evidence of this grotesque attack to the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Is it her intention that their findings should be referred both to the Russians, to the United Nations and to ourselves? And will she consider, in the light of that finding, go further on unexplained wealth orders and other financial sanctions against Russia if necessary?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that, of course, we are asking the OPCW to independently verify this so that it can be clear to everyone the nature of this nerve agent. Can I also say to him that, as I've said earlier in response to the unexplained wealth orders, these are things which we do operate, we do use, and we have introduced, but we will always ensure that they are done on evidence and, obviously, we operate according to the rule of law.
Margaret Hodge.
Can I welcome the Prime Minister's clear statement and her condemnation of the Russians and the action she's taken? And can I in particular welcome the fact that she is adopting the Magnitsky Amendment now from the government? But can I say to her, too much money is being laundered out of Russia and finding its way into the British system. And there are two things she could do pretty quickly which would help to tackle that. In the first place, she could bring forward the public register of ownership of properties, which was promised by her predecessor in 2015 and has been delayed by this government. And in the second place, she could increase transparency in our corporate structures so we would know who forms companies here, where the money comes from, and deal with it if it's illicit money brought in by unsavoury people.
Can I say to the right honourable lady, in relation to the issue that she's raised about the transparency in relation to property ownership, that is something that I have discussed with the Business Secretary. We haven't been delaying that. We do need to ensure that we get that right when we introduce it, but we have been discussing the timing for introducing that because we do want to ensure we've got all the tools in our locker that we can use and can help us in this in the endeavour that we're engaged in.
Nicky Morgan.
I want to absolutely 100% support the Prime Minister's statement and the actions that she is taking. And to follow up just from the last question, I want to particularly pick up on the Prime Minister's statement that there is no place for serious criminals and corrupt elites or their money in our country. There are amendments which I'm sure Parliament will support, but will the Prime Minister also bear in mind that the select committees could have a real role here in teasing out information, what is going on, to tackle